The call from Maplewood Community Bank came at 10:17 on a Monday morning. Mrs. Williams, the teller, whispered, "Your daughter is here, trying to withdraw all $80,000 from your savings account." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Emily had brought copies of my identification papers bearing my signature, and a story claiming I was no longer mentally capable of managing my own money. But just before the teller approved the withdrawal, she opened my account and found a confidential note marked in red. She read the first line, locked her computer, and called the branch manager. The note had been placed there by my husband before he died, and it mentioned my daughter by name. Before I tell you what Thomas knew, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own child tried to take everything you had left? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. My name is Susan Williams, and until 18 months ago, I believed I had lived the kind of ordinary life people often overlook. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I never owned a vacation home or drove an expensive car, but I had something I thought was worth more than any of those things. I had a husband who loved me. I had a daughter I trusted. And I had a little white house in Maplewood, Ohio, where every room carried a memory. Looking back now, I realized that losing my husband wasn't the hardest thing that happened to me. It was discovering that grief can make you vulnerable in ways you never imagined. I spent 39 years working as a librarian at Maplewood High School. Every morning, I unlocked the library before the students arrived. I watched generations of children grow from awkward freshmen into confident adults ready to begin their own lives. Books taught me that every story had villains. I just never expected one of mine to share my last name. My husband, Thomas Williams, was a carpenter. He built kitchen cabinets, repaired porches, and restored antique furniture for families all over our county. His hands were rough-scarred and always smelled faintly of cedarwood no matter how many times he washed them. He used to joke that wood had become part of his skin. Thomas wasn't a man who talked very much. When he did speak, people listened. He believed promises mattered. He believed debt should be paid. I believed that if someone trusted you, protecting that trust became your responsibility. When we married, neither of us had much money. We bought our little house when mortgage rates were painfully high, and for years we counted every dollar before buying groceries. There were Christmases when our gifts came from garage sales, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes, vacations meant driving to the nearest lake with sandwiches packed in an old cooler, and somehow those became the happiest years of our lives. When our daughter Emily was born, Thomas cried harder than I did. He held her so carefully, almost afraid she might break in his arms. He promised that little girl he would always protect her. For decades, I believed he kept that promise. Emily grew into a bright, determined young woman. She graduated from Ohio State University with a business degree and later married Brian Carter, an ambitious contractor who owned a home remodeling company. At first, Brian impressed everyone. He was confident without appearing arrogant. He talked about expanding his business, hiring local workers, and one day passing the company down to his children. Thomas liked him. Or at least, I thought he did. Emily and Brian gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren. Daniel was 14 now, always carrying a basketball wherever he went. Little Sophie had just turned and still insisted on calling me Grandma Sue instead of Grandma Susan. Those 2 children were the brightest parts of my week. Every Friday evening, they came over for dinner. Thomas would grill hamburgers while Sophie helped me bake cookies. Daniel always pretended he was too old to enjoy dessert, yet somehow he managed to eat 3 chocolate chip cookies before we even sat down. When Thomas became sick, everything changed far more quickly than any of us expected. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor spoke gently, but I remember almost none of his words after hearing those 2 sentences. Thomas squeezed my hand so tightly I thought my fingers might bruise. Then he smiled at me. "It's going to be all right," he whispered. It wasn't. Over the next 11 months, I watched the strongest man I had ever known become weaker each week. The man who could lift solid oak cabinets by himself eventually struggled to button his own shirt. Cancer doesn't just steal a person's body. It steals routines, conversations, plans, the future. Emily visited often during those months. She brought groceries. She picked up prescriptions. She drove Thomas to chemotherapy appointments whenever I needed a break. More than once, I told friends how lucky I was to have a daughter like her. "I don't know what I'd do without Emily," I remember saying. Every single word was true. At the time, Thomas passed away on a quiet October morning while I was holding his hand. His last words weren't dramatic. He simply looked at me and said, "You'll be okay." Then he was gone. The silence afterward felt unbearable. For weeks I wandered through our house expecting to hear his tools in the garage or his footsteps coming down the hallway. Instead, all I heard was the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, my own breathing. His medical treatments had been expensive. Even with Medicare and supplemental insurance, the deductibles, medications, specialists, and home hospice care drained our savings much faster than we'd ever imagined. Then came funeral expenses. Roof repairs after a severe spring storm. A new furnace that failed just weeks after Thomas died. By the time everything was paid, the retirement account we'd spent decades building had been reduced to exactly $80,000. Some people might think $80,000 sounds like a fortune. For a retired widow in her late 60s, it wasn't. It represented every doctor's visit I might someday need, every prescription, every emergency, every property tax payment. Every month, I hoped to remain independent in the home Thomas had built with his own hands. It wasn't luxury. It was security. It was dignity. Emily seemed to understand that. After Thomas's funeral, she began visiting almost every weekend. She stocked my refrigerator. She mowed my lawn when Brian couldn't. She helped me understand online banking because Thomas had always handled the computer. She even organized my medical paperwork into neat folders labeled by color. I remember thinking how responsible she'd become. Sometimes she'd stay late after dinner, sitting beside me in the living room while we looked through old family photo albums. We laughed about Daniel's terrible toddler haircut. We cried over pictures of Thomas smiling beside the Christmas tree. She would squeeze my hand and tell me she worried about me being alone. "I just want to make sure you're okay, Mom," she'd say. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter, my only child. Gradually, though, our conversations began changing. At first, it seemed harmless. "Mom, do you still have the retirement account? Are your investments earning enough interest? Have you updated your will since Dad passed? Who's listed as the beneficiary now?" Then the questions became more specific. "How much is left in savings? Where do you keep the house deed? Do you still remember all your online passwords? If something happened to you tomorrow, would anyone know where everything is?" Each question sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to see. Whenever a small voice inside me whispered that something felt unusual, I immediately silenced it. I told myself Emily was simply being responsible. After all, she had spent months helping me rebuild my life. She had been there when I cried. She had held my hand at the cemetery. She had promised she would never let me face old age alone. The thought that my own daughter could have another reason for asking those questions never crossed my mind. Not then. Not until everything I believed about my family began to fall apart. The first missing money wasn't enough to make me suspicious. It was $118. I noticed it while balancing my checkbook one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I still kept a handwritten register, even though Emily insisted no one did that anymore. "You should let the app do all of that for you," she'd said more than once. I smiled every time she mentioned it. "I've trusted this little notebook for 40 years, I would tell her. It hasn't let me down yet." That afternoon, however, the notebook told me something I couldn't explain. A debit card purchase at a grocery store across town, $118. I frowned, trying to remember whether I'd made a special shopping trip. My memory wasn't perfect anymore, but I certainly wasn't driving 20 miles across town for groceries. Before I had time to worry, Emily called. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" "Oh, I'm all right," I answered. "Emily, did you happen to use my debit card recently?" There was only a second of silence. "Oh, yes," she said cheerfully. "Remember, you asked me to pick up groceries after your doctor's appointment." I tried to picture the conversation. Maybe I had. The appointment had been stressful. The doctor wanted additional blood work because my cholesterol had crept higher than expected. Perhaps I'd forgotten. "I'm sorry," I said. "I must have completely blanked." Emily laughed. "See, that's exactly why I keep telling you to let me help more." Her tone wasn't cruel. It sounded loving, protective. I apologized again before hanging up. A week later, another charge appeared, $264. This time, it was from a home improvement store. I stared at the receipt online. Paint supplies, hardware, garden tools. I certainly hadn't purchased any of those things. When I asked Emily about it, she answered immediately. "Oh, Brian fixed your back fence while you were at church. We needed extra supplies." I walked outside after our phone call. The fence had indeed been repaired. Fresh wooden boards stood where the old ones had rotted away. I felt embarrassed for questioning her. She hadn't stolen from me. She'd improved my property. Maybe she simply forgot to tell me she was using my card. Again, I let it go. Over the following 2 months, little expenses continued appearing. $79, $143, $312. Never enough to frighten me. Always just enough to be believable. Emily always had an explanation ready. Medicine, gasoline, replacement smoke detector batteries, a locksmith, dog food for a neighbor she'd helped while running errands. Some of the explanations even made me feel guilty for asking. One evening, she sighed into the phone. "Mom, I'm trying so hard to make your life easier." "I know. Sometimes I spend my own money first because it's faster. Then I reimburse myself later." "I understand. I wish you'd trust me." Every time she said those words, I felt ashamed. Trust me. How could a mother not trust her own daughter? Meanwhile, Brian's visits became strangely different. He no longer talked excitedly about new remodeling contracts. Instead, he complained, constantly. "Lumber prices are killing us. Customers don't want to pay. The banks have become impossible. Insurance companies delay everything. There aren't enough skilled workers anymore." Every conversation ended with another financial disaster. One contractor hadn't paid him. Another customer canceled a project halfway through. Equipment needed replacing. Taxes had increased. At first, I sympathized. Running a business had never been easy. Thomas used to say that owning a small company meant solving 10 new problems before breakfast every morning. But eventually, I noticed something. Brian never talked about solutions. Only emergencies. Only disasters. Only money. Emily began echoing him. "You know, Mom, houses are expensive to maintain." "I know. That roof will probably need replacing in another 5 years." "I've thought about that. And property taxes keep increasing." "They do." She hesitated before continuing. "Have you ever considered selling?" The question caught me off guard. Selling the house. I looked around my living room. Thomas had built every bookshelf lining the walls. The rocking chair beside the fireplace had belonged to his grandmother. The dining table still carried tiny scratches from when Emily had done homework there as a teenager. "This is my home," I answered quietly. Emily nodded. I know. But it's too much for one person. I manage. You could move into one of those beautiful retirement communities. I'm not ready. You'd have friends. I already have friends. You wouldn't have to mow the lawn anymore. I actually like mowing the lawn. She laughed, but it sounded forced. Mom, be realistic. I am. You live alone. Yes. What if you fall? I might. What if no one finds you? I could say the same thing about anyone who lives by themselves. Emily leaned forward. I'm only trying to protect you. And I appreciate that. But I don't want to leave this house. Her smile disappeared. You know what I think. What? I think you're holding onto a building instead of moving forward. Her words stung. This building, I said softly, is where your father carried you through the front door after you were born. She looked away. This building is where he taught you how to ride a bicycle. Silence. This building is where we celebrated every Christmas you've ever had. Emily crossed her arms. You can't live in memories forever. No, but memories are worth living beside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her voice changed. It became sharper, harder. You're being stubborn. The sentence hung between us. I'd never heard my daughter speak to me like that before. I don't think that's fair. No, she replied quickly. What's not fair is watching you make bad decisions because you're too emotional. I stared at her. She seemed to realize what she'd said. Almost instantly, her expression softened. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean it like that. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm just scared of losing you too. The mention of Thomas dissolved my anger. Of course she missed her father. Of course grief affected her too. I forgave her before she even finished apologizing. That became a pattern. Emily would push too hard, say something hurtful, then apologize with tears in her eyes. And every single time, I forgave her. Because mothers do that. Or at least, I believed they should. One Saturday afternoon, she asked if she could organize my important paperwork. It'll save everyone time in an emergency. I agreed. Together, we sorted insurance policies, tax returns, utility bills, and warranty documents. She worked carefully, placing everything into labeled folders. Then she paused. Mom, where do you keep the original deed to the house? In the fireproof safe. Oh. She smiled casually. And your savings account statements? They're there too. What about your social security card? Also in the safe. She nodded thoughtfully. Smart. I didn't think anything of it. Looking back now, I realized she wasn't making conversation. She was taking inventory. Every answer I gave became another piece of information she quietly stored away. Every folder she touched showed her where something valuable was kept. Every innocent question brought her one step closer to understanding exactly how my financial life worked. At the time, I believed I was letting my daughter help me prepare for the future. I had no idea. She was preparing for a very different future. One that didn't include asking my permission. A few weeks after Emily suggested I sell my house, I found myself thinking about something Thomas had said shortly before he died. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now it refused to leave my mind. The memory came back one quiet afternoon while I was watering the roses he had planted beside our front porch. He loved those roses. Every spring, he would kneel in the dirt for hours, trimming branches and pulling weeds until each bush looked perfect. He used to tell me flowers rewarded patience. People didn't always. Standing there with the garden hose in my hand, I suddenly remembered one particular morning during the last months of his illness. He had barely been strong enough to walk across the living room. Yet somehow, he insisted on getting dressed. I need to go to the bank, he said. I looked up from the breakfast table. The bank? He nodded. It won't take long. You can barely stand. I'll manage. I offered to drive him. He shook his head. I need to do this myself. That surprised me. Thomas never cared who drove. In fact, during chemotherapy, he happily let me drive everywhere because he became exhausted so easily. But that morning was different. There was determination in his eyes. The kind of determination I'd seen only a handful of times during our marriage. I remember asking him what was so important. He smiled. Just tying up a loose end. What loose end? You'll understand one day. I laughed. You're being mysterious. Maybe. He kissed my forehead before leaving. I'll be back before lunch. He returned almost 2 hours later. Longer than I'd expected. His face looked pale, but not from the cancer. It was something else. Something heavier. He sat quietly in his favorite chair for several minutes without saying a word. I brought him a cup of tea. Everything all right? He looked at me with tired eyes. Yes. But he hesitated. There are some things I hope you'll never have to worry about. I frowned. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he reached for my hand. Susan. Yes. No matter how much you love someone. He stopped, then continued more slowly. Never sign anything you haven't read from beginning to end. I laughed softly. I've always done that. I know. But promise me anyway. I promise. And if anyone ever tells you that paperwork has to be signed immediately, he squeezed my hand. That's exactly when you should slow down. I remember teasing him. Who are you talking about, insurance salesman? He smiled. People. That's very helpful. I mean it. I know. If something feels rushed, he paused again. Walk away. I assumed he was talking generally. Thomas had always been cautious. He read every warranty, every insurance policy, every mortgage document. He even read instruction manuals before assembling furniture. Being careful was simply part of who he was. Never, not once, did I imagine those words were directed at someone specific. After he died, I replayed that conversation several times. Eventually, I convinced myself grief had given ordinary memories too much meaning. Until one Saturday afternoon changed everything. Emily arrived carrying coffee and cinnamon rolls from my favorite bakery. She hugged me tightly. I thought we could spend the morning together. That sounds nice. We talked for nearly an hour. The grandchildren had soccer games. Brian was busy meeting a client. The weather was finally warming after a long Ohio winter. Everything felt normal. Then Emily opened her purse. I almost forgot. She pulled out a thick manila folder. I brought a few papers. What kind of papers? Oh, nothing exciting. She laughed. Just practical things. I looked at the folder. Like what? She placed several pages on my dining room table. I've been thinking about if you were ever hospitalized. I hope not. So do I. She smiled reassuringly. But accidents happen. I nodded. I guess they do. Well, she tapped the stack of papers. These would let me help if there was an emergency. I glanced at the first page. The title mentioned healthcare decisions. That seemed reasonable. The second page referred to insurance communications. Also reasonable. Emily had already been helping me with paperwork. Nothing about it seemed unusual. I asked a friend who works at a law office, she explained. She said everyone our age should have these. Our age, she laughed. I mean your age. Thank you. You know what I mean. I smiled. She handed me a pen. If you sign these now, we won't have to worry later. Something about the sentence bothered me. Not enough to refuse, just enough to hesitate. I'd like to read them first. Of course. She sounded cheerful. Then she checked her watch. The only problem is… What? The notary is only available until noon. I looked at the clock. 11:18. We don't have much time. She slid the first page toward me. I highlighted all the signature lines. Yellow sticky tabs marked each place where I needed to sign. I still want to read everything. You can. She smiled patiently. But most of it is legal language. I know. I already had it explained. I'm sure you did. It basically says I can speak to insurance companies and doctors if you're unconscious. That sounded sensible. I began reading. The first page matched what she'd described. The second did too. Then the phone rang. It was the heating company returning my call about a strange noise my furnace had started making. The technician talked for nearly 15 minutes. When I returned to the table, Emily had arranged the pages into a neat stack. Everything okay? I think so. They're coming Monday. Yes. Good. She pushed the papers back toward me. Let's finish these before the notary leaves. I picked up the pen, signed the first page, then the second. As I reached for the third, a single phrase caught my eye. Financial authority. I frowned. Emily. Yes. What is this? She leaned over casually. Oh. Why does this mention financial authority? It's standard. It says authority over banking transactions. Only if something happens to you. I kept reading. The further down the page I went, the colder I felt. The document wasn't limited to emergencies. It granted broad authority over bank accounts, retirement funds, property matters, financial records, investment decisions. It even mentioned real estate transactions. I slowly lowered the paper. You said these were medical forms. They mostly are. No. I tapped the page. This isn't. Emily's smile disappeared. Mom, you told me this was about doctors. It includes financial protection. You didn't tell me that. I didn't think it mattered. It matters. She sighed dramatically. You're overreacting. I don't think I am. She reached for the papers. Just sign them. No. Her expression changed instantly. Not disappointment. Anger. Sharp. Unexpected. Do you know how difficult you're making this? I blinked. Difficult. I'm trying to help you. I appreciate that. Then sign. I won't sign something I haven't finished reading. You've already read enough. No. She stood abruptly. I've spent months taking care of you. I know. I drive you places. I know. I shop for you. I'm grateful. And this is how you repay me. My heart sank. Emily, you think I'm trying to steal from you. I didn't say that. You don't have to. Tears filled her eyes. I can't believe my own mother doesn't trust me. For a brief moment, I almost apologized, almost picked up the pen, almost ignored the knot in my stomach. Then Thomas's voice echoed through my memory. If something feels rushed, walk away. I gently closed the folder. I'd like an attorney to review these first. Emily stared at me. Neither of us spoke. Then she grabbed the papers, shoved them back into the folder, and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she turned around. I hope you remember this the next time you need my help. The door slammed so hard, the pictures on my hallway wall rattled. I stood alone in the silence for the first time since Thomas died. I wasn't wondering whether I had offended my daughter. I was wondering why she had been so desperate to get my signature. And deep inside, a fear I had been refusing to acknowledge finally began to take shape. Emily didn't call for 6 days. That might not sound unusual to some families, but for us, it was almost unheard of. Since Thomas's death, she had called me nearly every evening. Sometimes the conversations lasted only 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. She always asked the same questions. Did you eat dinner? How are you feeling? Do you need anything from the store? The silence that followed our argument felt heavier than I expected. The first day, I assumed she simply needed time to cool off. By the third day, I considered calling her. Twice, I picked up my phone. Twice, I put it back down. I kept hearing the way she'd said those words. I hope you remember this the next time you need my help. It hadn't sounded like concern. It had sounded like a warning. Late Friday afternoon, my neighbor Margaret Ellis knocked on my front door, carrying a blueberry pie. Margaret had lived across the street for nearly 25 years. She was 71, widowed like me, and possessed the remarkable ability to sense when something was wrong before anyone else noticed. I baked too much, she announced. You always bake too much. I know, she smiled. That's why people like having me as a neighbor. Over coffee, we talked about ordinary things. The church fundraiser, the unusually warm spring weather, her grandson's college graduation. Then she looked directly at me. What happened with Emily? I nearly dropped my coffee cup. What makes you think something happened? Margaret shrugged. She drove away from your house last Saturday like she was trying to win the Indianapolis 500. I sighed. Did you see that? The whole neighborhood probably saw it. For a moment, I considered changing the subject. Instead, I told her everything. The paperwork, the pressure, the financial authority form, the argument. Margaret listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, she remained silent for several seconds. Then she asked a question I hadn't expected. Did you keep a copy? A copy of the paperwork. No. She frowned. I wish you had. I didn't think about it. I would have liked to know exactly what she wanted you to sign. So would I. Margaret reached across the table. Susan? Yes. I want you to promise me something. What? If anyone ever asks you to sign legal papers again, I won't. No. She shook her head. Promise me you'll have a lawyer read them first. I smiled. I already decided that. Good. She hesitated before continuing. My sister went through something similar. I looked up. What happened? Her son convinced her to sign a power of attorney. Was it legitimate? At first. What do you mean? Paid her bills, handled her banking, helped with taxes. Everything looked perfectly normal. And then he started making decisions she never approved. A chill ran through me. Could she stop him? Eventually. But it took lawyers. Court hearings. Thousands of dollars. Their relationship never recovered. I sat quietly. Margaret's story sounded disturbingly familiar. Different family. Different people. The same pattern. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly. You aren't being paranoid. I hope not. Trust your instincts. After she left, I walked into my bedroom and opened the fireproof safe Thomas had installed years earlier. Inside were neatly organized folders, insurance policies, birth certificates, tax returns, our marriage certificate, the deed to the house, savings account statements, everything exactly where it had always been. At least, almost everything. One folder caught my attention. It contained our estate planning documents. Thomas had always kept them perfectly arranged. Now they looked different, not dramatically, just enough to make me pause. The papers weren't in the same order I remembered. One page had been folded differently. A paper clip had been replaced. I frowned. Maybe I'd done it myself. Maybe Emily had reorganized them while helping me. I tried to convince myself that was all it was. Yet something continued bothering me. I carefully removed every document from the folder. Halfway through, I noticed a faint crease near the bottom of one page, as if someone had photocopied it. The realization made my stomach tighten. Had Emily copied these documents to help organize them? Or, for another reason, I suddenly remembered something else. Months earlier, while sorting paperwork together, Emily had borrowed my printer. She'd mentioned needing to print school forms for Sophie. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Now I couldn't remember whether she'd actually printed anything or scanned something. The uncertainty unsettled me. Saturday morning, I decided to visit Maplewood Community Bank. Not because I believed anything was wrong. I simply wanted peace of mind. Rachel Bennett, one of the tellers, greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams." "Good morning, Rachel. What can we do for you today?" "I'd like to review my accounts." "Of course." She led me to a small desk near the windows. Rachel had worked at the bank for years. She was probably in her early 40s, always calm, always patient. Thomas used to say she was the kind of employee every business hoped to hire. She printed several statements and reviewed them with me. Everything appeared normal: savings, checking, certificates of deposit. Nothing seemed unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Rachel." "Yes." This may sound like a strange question. "Go ahead." "If someone tried to access my account without permission," she immediately became serious. "We have multiple security procedures." "What kind?" "We verify identification. We monitor unusual transactions. We review account notes." The last phrase caught my attention. "Account notes." She smiled politely. "Internal security instructions." "Oh, sometimes customers request additional verification." "Like what?" "If someone is elderly, if there's a history of fraud, if they want extra protection." I nodded slowly. "I see." Rachel tilted her head. "Is there something you're concerned about?" For a second, I almost told her everything. Instead, I smiled. "No. I just wanted to understand how things work." She didn't seem entirely convinced. "If you ever have concerns, Mrs. Williams," she handed me her business card, "please call us immediately." "I will." As I stood to leave, she added one more sentence. "Your husband always believed in being careful." I stopped walking. "You remember him?" "Very well." "He came in often." A warm smile crossed her face. "He always double-checked everything." I laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like Thomas." Rachel hesitated. "He cared a great deal about protecting you." The words lingered in the air. Protecting you. I thanked her and walked outside, but they stayed with me all afternoon. That evening, while watching television, my phone finally rang. Emily. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. "Hi." "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded unusually cheerful, too cheerful. "I've been thinking." "So have I." "I hate fighting." "So do I." "I overreacted." "I appreciate you saying that." "I'm sorry." The apology sounded sincere, or at least practiced. "I forgive you." "I knew you would." Something about that sentence bothered me. Not because it was rude, because it sounded certain, as though forgiveness had never been in doubt. She continued talking. "I was wondering." "Yes." "Would you like to have dinner tomorrow?" "Just us." "Actually." She hesitated. "Brian will be there too." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "What's the occasion?" "Oh, nothing special. We just want to talk." "About what?" "Our future." The words seemed oddly chosen. "Our future. You'll understand tomorrow." Before I could ask another question, she changed the subject. "So, 6 o'clock. Against my better judgment, I agreed. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the dark living room. Thomas's photograph rested on the mantel above the fireplace. His familiar smile seemed almost alive in the soft light. "I wish you were here," I whispered. For years, whenever life became confusing, Thomas had known exactly what to do. Now I had to figure it out alone. What I didn't know was that the dinner Emily had just invited me to wasn't about reconciliation. It was about convene to make one decision that would change everything. And this time, she wasn't planning to leave without getting what she wanted. Sunday arrived gray and unusually humid, the kind of Ohio afternoon that made the air feel heavy before a summer storm. I spent the morning trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Emily had apologized. Perhaps the dinner truly was an attempt to repair our relationship. Families argued. That didn't automatically mean families fell apart. Still, as I dressed for dinner, I found myself choosing the pearl necklace Thomas had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. Whenever I wore it, I somehow felt less alone. I drove to Emily and Brian's house just before 6. The neighborhood was one of the newer developments outside Maplewood. Large brick homes, fresh landscaping, 3-car garages. When they first bought the place 5 years earlier, Brian proudly told everyone his business had finally become successful enough to afford it. Today, however, something felt different. The driveway looked unusually empty. Brian's company truck was gone. So was the enclosed trailer that normally sat beside the garage. Even several expensive landscaping tools I remembered seeing weeks earlier had disappeared. I told myself they were probably at a job site. Emily opened the front door with an unusually enthusiastic smile. "Mom," she hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you came." "So am I." The smell of roast chicken drifted through the house. Sophie ran into the hallway first. "Grandma Sue!" She wrapped both arms around my waist. Daniel followed more slowly, pretending 14-year-old boys were too mature for hugs. He hailed miserably. "Hi, Grandma. It's good to see you." His smile looked forced. Children notice more than adults realize. Brian appeared from the kitchen carrying a glass of iced tea. "There she is." He shook my hand instead of hugging me. An odd choice, almost formal. "Dinner's almost ready." The meal itself was pleasant enough. We talked about Daniel's basketball tournament, Sophie's piano recital, the upcoming 4th of July parade. No one mentioned paperwork. No one mentioned bank accounts. No one mentioned our argument. Halfway through dessert, Emily cleared her throat. "So, there it was. I've been thinking." Brian immediately leaned forward. "We both have." I quietly placed my fork on the plate. Emily folded her hands together. "Mom, you know we love you." "I know. And we worry about you." "I know that too." Brian nodded. "We've been discussing your future." I smiled politely. "It seems everyone has been discussing my future except me." Emily laughed awkwardly. "We're only trying to help." She reached into a drawer beside the dining table. My heart sank. Another folder. This one was blue instead of brown. "I promise this isn't like last time." She slid several printed pages across the table. "What is it?" "A financial plan." I didn't touch the papers. Brian began speaking as though he'd rehearsed every word. "We sat down with a financial advisor." "You did?" "Yes. He helped us figure out how you could eliminate almost all your monthly expenses." "I wasn't aware I had that many." Emily smiled. "Mom, the house is worth nearly $450,000 now." "I know. You're living in an asset." "I'm living in my home," Brian continued before I could say anything else. If you sold the house, he pointed to a spreadsheet, you could move into a beautiful retirement community. You'd have no maintenance, Emily added quickly. No snow shoveling. No lawn mowing. No expensive repairs. Brian smiled. And after investing the remaining money, you'd actually have more monthly income than you do now. Everything sounded reasonable. Almost too reasonable. I finally looked at the papers. The calculations were detailed. Estimated sale price. Closing costs. Investment projections. Monthly retirement income. Someone had clearly spent time preparing them. Who made this? Brian answered immediately. My financial consultant. What consultant? A friend. What friend? He hesitated. Kevin. The one from your company. Brian looked surprised. You remember Kevin? I've met him. He understands investments. I continued reading. Something caught my attention. The projected sale price looked unusually low. $450,000. That's conservative. I thought houses on this street were selling for over $500,000. Emily quickly answered. The market's slowing. I don't think it is. Brian leaned back. Either way, he smiled again. The exact number isn't really the point. No, the point is simplifying your life. I looked around the table. Both of them were watching me carefully, waiting, measuring every reaction. For the first time, I realized this dinner wasn't spontaneous. It had been planned, probably for weeks. I appreciate the effort. Emily brightened. So you'll think about it. I already have. And I'm not selling. Silence. Brian forced a smile. You don't have to decide tonight. I already did. Emily's expression tightened. Mom, I'm happy where I am. You won't always be able to manage that house. Maybe. What if you fall? You asked me that before. What if your health gets worse? Then I'll deal with it. Brian leaned forward. Susan, the use of my first name instead of Mom or Mrs. Williams felt strangely deliberate. You need to think logically. I am. No. He shook his head. You're thinking emotionally. I've lived in that home for 42 years. Exactly. That isn't emotion. What is it then? It's my life. Emily suddenly pushed the papers toward me again. At least sign permission for us to meet with the realtor. I looked up sharply. The realtor? So we can get an appraisal. I don't want an appraisal. It doesn't commit you to selling. I know. So what's the problem? The problem is that I said no. Brian's smile vanished. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I don't think I am. Emily sighed dramatically. You know, she folded her arms. Dad would have wanted you to be practical. The words struck me like a slap. I looked directly into her eyes. Don't tell me what your father would have wanted. Her face reddened. I knew him too. You knew him as your father. I knew him as my husband. The room became painfully quiet. Even the children stopped eating. Daniel stared down at his plate. Sophie looked nervously between her parents and me. Brian cleared his throat. No one's trying to upset anyone. I stood. I think it's time for me to go. Emily rose quickly. Mom, don't do this. I'm not doing anything. We're having a conversation. No. I picked up my purse. You prepared a presentation? Brian stepped into the hallway before I reached the front door. You can't avoid this forever. I stopped walking. What does that mean? It means... He hesitated. Eventually, someone will have to make decisions. I'll make them. You won't always be able to. For a brief second, our eyes met. Something cold flashed across his face. Not concern. Calculation. Then it disappeared. Emily hurried over. I'm sorry. She reached for my arm. We're only trying to protect you. I gently stepped away. I've heard that sentence a lot lately. I walked outside before anyone could stop me. As I backed my car out of the driveway, I glanced toward the living room window. Brian and Emily were already talking. Their expressions weren't disappointed. They looked frustrated, almost desperate. The moment I arrived home, I locked the front door behind me. Not because I thought anyone would come inside, because for the first time in my entire life, my own home no longer felt completely safe. The next morning, I tried to push the entire evening out of my mind. I made coffee, watered the roses, read half a chapter of a mystery novel. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Susan Williams? Yes. This is Jennifer Walsh with Maplewood Realty. I frowned. I'm sorry. Who? I'm following up regarding your request for a property valuation. My heart skipped. My request? Yes. We received an online inquiry asking us to prepare a market analysis for your home. I never contacted your office. There was a brief silence. Oh, Jennifer sounded confused. The request included your full name, your address, your phone number, and your email. A chill spread through my entire body. Someone had submitted the request pretending to be me. And suddenly, I knew exactly who had access to every piece of that information. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly, my fingers began to ache. I'm sorry, I said carefully. Could you repeat that? The realtor, Jennifer Walsh, sounded just as confused as I felt. We received an online request yesterday evening asking for a complimentary market evaluation of your property. Yesterday. Yes, ma'am. My stomach tightened. Yesterday evening. Only a few hours after dinner at Emily's house. I never submitted that request. Oh. Jennifer paused. I'm terribly sorry. The person who filled out the form knew quite a bit of information. What kind of information? They provided your full legal name, property address, telephone number, email address, and indicated that you were interested in selling within the next 60 to 90 days. I slowly sat down. I never said that. I understand. They also requested that we contact you directly instead of speaking with family members. That sentence caught my attention. Instead of speaking with family members. Yes. It was written in the notes. My heart began beating faster. Someone had deliberately instructed the realtor not to discuss the request with anyone else. Whoever submitted it had expected Jennifer to call me personally. But why? If Emily or Brian wanted to secretly sell my house, why would they want me contacted? Unless... I suddenly had another thought. Jennifer. Yes. Did the online request include an email address? It did. Could you tell me which one? She read it aloud. It was my email. Exactly. Even the spelling was correct. What about the phone number? She read that too. Mine. Everything belonged to me. Everything except the request itself. I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding, Jennifer said kindly. I'll remove your information immediately. Thank you. As we ended the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes. Something wasn't right. Emily knew my email password. Months earlier, she'd helped me recover access after I accidentally locked myself out. She had insisted on writing the new password inside a small notebook, just in case. At the time, I appreciated the help. Now I couldn't remember whether I'd ever changed it afterward. I walked into my small office and turned on my computer. Technology had never been my strength, but I knew enough to check recent account activity. After several frustrating minutes, I finally found the security settings. There it was. A login from another device. Saturday evening, 9:42 p.m., while I had been sleeping. The location simply said Maplewood. My hands became cold. I hadn't opened my email Saturday night. Someone else had. I immediately changed the password. Then I changed the password again for my online banking. Then another for my retirement account. Every password Thomas had ever created suddenly felt too simple, too familiar, too exposed. Afterward, I called my internet provider to enable two-factor authentication on every account that offered it. The representative patiently walked me through each step. When I finally hung up, I felt exhausted, not because the process had been difficult, because I realized I was protecting myself from someone I had trusted my entire life. Around lunchtime, the doorbell rang. I looked through the window before opening it. Emily. She stood on the porch, holding 2 grocery bags. For a brief moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. Instead, I opened the door. "Hi, Mom." "Hello?" "I brought groceries." "I didn't ask for groceries." "I know." She smiled warmly. "I was already shopping." She walked inside before I answered. Normally, I wouldn't have minded. Today, I noticed everything. Her eyes swept across the living room, the hallway, the staircase, almost as though she were checking whether anything had changed. "I bought your favorite yogurt." "Thank you." "And fresh strawberries." That was thoughtful. She placed everything neatly inside the refrigerator, exactly where she'd always done it. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen a loving daughter taking care of her widowed mother. I wanted to believe that was all it was. "I've been thinking about yesterday," she said. "So have I." "I'm sorry if Brian came across too strongly." "He did. He worries." "I understand." She closed the refrigerator door. "Can we just forget the whole thing?" "I'd like that." She smiled with visible relief. "I hate when we're upset with each other." "So do I." For several minutes, we chatted about ordinary things again. Daniel's summer basketball camp, Sophie's piano lessons, the weather forecast. Then Emily casually wandered toward my office. "I haven't seen this room in a while." "I've been organizing it. It looks nice?" She stepped inside. My computer remained on. The password manager window was still open, only for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Her eyes landed on the screen, almost instantly. Then she looked away, too quickly. "You've been using the computer more." "I'm learning." "Dad would have been proud." She smiled again, that same careful smile. I quietly walked over and locked the screen. Her expression didn't change, but I noticed her shoulders stiffen ever so slightly. "Still don't trust technology," she joked. "I'm learning to trust it," I answered calmly. "Just not everyone who uses it." The room became silent. For one brief second, neither of us moved. Then she laughed. "I have no idea what that means." "I'm sure you don't." She left shortly afterward. As I watched her drive away, I realized something important. She had never once asked how I was feeling. She had never asked about my doctor's appointment. She hadn't even mentioned Thomas. Instead, she had looked at my office, my computer, my paperwork, just like before. That afternoon, I drove back to Maplewood Community Bank. Rachel recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Williams." "I'm sorry to bother you again." "You're never a bother." "May I speak with someone privately?" Her smile faded. "Of course." A few minutes later, I found myself sitting inside branch manager Michael Harris's office. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and calm eyes. Thomas had respected him. After exchanging greetings, I took a deep breath. I think someone may be trying to gain access to my financial information. Michael didn't interrupt. He simply listened. I told him about the paperwork, the pressure to sell my house, the mysterious realtor request, the email login, everything. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. I'm glad you came. You are? Very. I was afraid I might sound paranoid. No. He folded his hands. I think you're doing exactly what you should. Relief washed over me. What can I do? We can increase the security level on all of your accounts. I'd like that. We can require in-person verification. Yes. We can place verbal security questions known only to you. Please. He typed several notes into his computer. Then he stopped. There is one more option. What is it? A confidential fraud alert. What does that do? If anyone attempts an unusual withdrawal or presents unexpected legal documents, our staff must contact you directly before processing anything. My heart pounded. I would appreciate that. Michael nodded. I'll arrange it personally. He printed several authorization forms. Unlike Emily's paperwork, he encouraged me to read every page. Take all the time you need. I appreciate that. Thomas's voice echoed in my mind once more. Read everything. I read every word. Only after I completely understood the documents did I sign them. Michael smiled. Your husband would approve. You knew Thomas well? For many years. He always believed in preparing for the unexpected. I smiled sadly. Yes. He certainly did. Michael glanced toward his computer screen. For a split second, something crossed his face. Recognition. Almost surprise. Then it disappeared. I noticed it immediately. Is something wrong? He looked back at me. No. But his answer came just a little too quickly. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had just seen something on my account that he hadn't expected. Something he wasn't ready to tell me. I couldn't stop thinking about Michael Harris's expression. It had lasted less than a second. A brief flicker across his face. But after spending nearly 4 decades watching teenagers try to hide unfinished homework and whispered conversations in the library, I'd become surprisingly good at recognizing when someone was holding something back. Michael had seen something. I was certain of it. The question was whether he couldn't tell me, or wouldn't. Is there anything else I should know? I asked. Michael smiled politely. At this point, your accounts are well protected. That's not what I asked. He folded his hands on the desk. I know. So, there isn't anything you need to worry about today. Today. The word stood out. Not ever. Not in general. Today. I thanked him anyway and left the bank, but his answer stayed with me during the drive home. The following Wednesday, life appeared to return to normal. Emily resumed calling every evening. She sounded cheerful, almost overly cheerful. She never mentioned the dinner. Never mentioned selling the house. Never mentioned paperwork again. If anything, she seemed determined to convince me everything had been a misunderstanding. One afternoon, she even surprised me by bringing Daniel and Sophie over after school. Watching the grandchildren laugh in my backyard almost made me believe the tension had disappeared. Daniel helped me trim the rose bushes. Sophie insisted on painting tiny flower pots for my porch. For nearly 3 hours, we were simply a family again. As they prepared to leave, Sophie hugged me tightly. I love coming here, Grandma Sue. I love having you here. She lowered her voice. Can I tell you something? Of course. She glanced toward the driveway where Emily was loading backpacks into the SUV. Mommy and Daddy argue a lot now. I felt my heart tighten. What do they argue about? she shrugged. I don't know. Did they say, I only hear little pieces? What kind of pieces? She thought for a moment. Daddy keeps saying, she frowned, trying to remember the exact words. If we don't fix this soon, we'll lose everything. My smile faded. Did he say what everything meant? She shook her head. No. Before I could ask another question, Emily called from outside. Sophie! I'm coming. The little girl kissed my cheek and ran toward the car. Children often reveal truths adults spend enormous effort trying to hide. That simple conversation stayed with me long after they drove away. The next morning, Margaret knocked on my door again. You busy? Not at all. She carried 2 coffees from the local cafe. I figured we could sit outside. As we settled onto the porch swing, she studied my face. You look tired. I haven't been sleeping well. I told her about my visit to the bank, about Michael's strange reaction, about Sophie's comment. Margaret listened carefully. Then she asked a question I hadn't considered. Have you looked into Brian's business? I blinked. What do you mean? I mean, have you ever checked whether everything he's been saying is actually true? I never had a reason to. Maybe now you do. The idea made me uncomfortable. Investigating my own son-in-law felt almost disloyal. Yet, wasn't pretending everything was fine even worse? That afternoon, curiosity finally overcame guilt. I opened my laptop and searched for Brian Carter Construction. The company website still looked impressive. Beautiful photographs, satisfied customers, large renovation projects. Everything appeared successful. Then I noticed something unusual. The company's social media page hadn't been updated in almost 4 months. That seemed odd. Brian used to post new projects every week. I searched further. Customer reviews, local business listings, building permits. Nothing alarming. Until I found a discussion on a neighborhood forum. One homeowner wrote, Has anyone else been waiting months for Brian Carter Construction to finish a remodel? Another replied, We're trying to get our deposit back. Another, No one's answering the office phone anymore. My pulse quickened. There were only a handful of comments. Nothing conclusive, but they painted a different picture than the one Brian presented. I searched the county court records. Again, I expected nothing. Instead, 3 civil cases appeared. Unpaid invoices, contract disputes, 1 lawsuit filed by a supplier. All within the last 8 months. I stared at the screen. Brian had repeatedly told us business was slowing. He'd never mentioned lawsuits, never mentioned customers demanding refunds, never mentioned suppliers taking legal action. I suddenly remembered every conversation we'd had over the past year. The complaints, the emergencies, the constant references to money. Maybe they hadn't been exaggerations after all. Maybe his business really was collapsing. But if that were true, why had Emily hidden it from me Friday morning, brought another surprise? The mail carrier delivered a certified envelope. The return address belonged to the county recorder's office. Confused, I opened it immediately. Inside was a notice confirming that someone had recently requested copies of public property records related to my home. Public records, nothing illegal. Anyone could request them. Yet something caught my eye. The request had been made 2 days after our dinner. I frowned. Why would anyone suddenly need copies of my property's official records unless they intended to use them? My phone rang before I could think further. It was Rachel Bennett from the bank. Mrs. Williams. Hello, Rachel. I'm sorry to bother you. Not at all. I wanted to verify something. My heart immediately began racing. Verify what? Has anyone asked you to add another person to your bank accounts? No. Has anyone asked you to remove security restrictions? No. Rachel paused. I thought so. What happened? This morning, someone called claiming to be your daughter. I froze. What? She requested information about the security procedures on your accounts. My mouth went dry. What did you tell her? Nothing. Relief flooded through me. Our policy doesn't allow us to discuss account security. Thank goodness. She sounded disappointed. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. Please don't apologize. Rachel lowered her voice. I thought you should know. Did she identify herself? Yes. Did she seem angry? Not angry. Rachel hesitated. Determined. After hanging up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. Emily hadn't tried to withdraw money. Not yet. She was gathering information, testing barriers, looking for weaknesses. Exactly the way someone studies a locked door before trying to open it. For the first time, I no longer wondered whether my suspicions were unfair. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern too clear to ignore. And then my cell phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel. It contained only one sentence. Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are hiding something from everyone. I stared at the screen. Before I could answer, a second message arrived. Can we talk without them knowing? For nearly a full minute, I simply stared at Daniel's message. Grandma, I think Mom and Dad are hiding something from everyone. Then the second one. Can we talk without them knowing? My first instinct was to call him immediately. My second was to stop myself. Daniel was only 14. If Emily or Brian saw my name on his phone, they would start asking questions. Instead, I replied carefully. Of course. Are you safe? The 3 little dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then returned. Finally, his answer arrived. Yes, I'm at basketball practice. Dad dropped me off. I exhaled slowly. Can you talk now? Only for a few minutes. Coach is coming. I typed one sentence. Tell me only what you feel comfortable telling me. Several moments passed. Then another message appeared. Dad's company is in serious trouble. I frowned. What makes you say that? They fight about money almost every night. That wasn't entirely surprising. But the next message was, last week, I heard Dad say if they couldn't get your money, everything would fall apart. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. Surely Daniel had misunderstood. Children sometimes overheard fragments of conversations and filled in the blanks themselves. I wanted that to be true. I desperately wanted it to be true. So I asked carefully, did he actually say, your money? Daniel answered almost immediately. Yes. Another message followed. Mom told him to be patient. I felt the blood drain from my face. Then another. She said, she'll eventually agree. My hands began trembling. Before I could ask another question, Daniel sent one last message. Coach is here. Please don't tell Mom I texted you. I won't. I promise. He replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji. Then the conversation ended. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing through the house. Every memory from the past year suddenly looked different. The repeated questions about my finances, the insistence that I move, the legal documents, the retirement community, the realtor, the calls to my bank. Individually, each event had seemed explainable. Together, they formed something I could no longer ignore. Still, I couldn't bring myself to believe Emily wanted to hurt me. There had to be another explanation. There simply had to. The following morning, I drove to church earlier than usual. Faith had carried Thomas and me through nearly every difficult season of our marriage. I hoped it might steady me again. After the service, our pastor, Reverend Charles Munro, noticed me sitting alone in one of the pews. Susan, good morning. You stayed behind. I needed a little quiet. He sat beside me without saying another word. For several minutes, we simply listened to the silence inside the sanctuary. Finally, he asked, "What's weighing on your heart?" I smiled weakly. "Everything." He nodded. "That's usually where people begin." I laughed despite myself. Without mentioning names, I described what had been happening. A family member pushing financial decisions. Pressure. Secrets. Growing distrust. When I finished, Reverend Monroe remained thoughtful. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has this person ever respected the word no?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Had Emily respected my decision? No. Every time I'd declined something, she'd returned with another argument, another plan, another attempt. "I don't think so." He nodded slowly. "People who truly wish to help you may disagree. They may worry. They may even plead. But eventually," he looked directly into my eyes, "they respect your answer." The sentence settled deep inside me. Respect your answer. Emily hadn't done that once. Monday morning brought another surprise. Margaret called just after breakfast. "You home?" "Yes." "I'm coming over." She sounded unusually serious. 10 minutes later, she walked into my kitchen carrying a folded newspaper. "I think you should see this." She pointed toward a small legal notice buried near the back. Most people would have skipped right over it. I almost did. Then I saw the company name, Carter Home Renovations, LLC. My heart skipped. "What is this? A notice of pending civil hearing." I read every word. One of Brian's suppliers was seeking payment for nearly $142,000 in unpaid materials. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. "This is public." Margaret nodded. "I happened to notice the company name." I stared silently at the notice. $142,000. No wonder they were desperate. No wonder Brian constantly talked about money. No wonder Emily wanted me to sell my house. The problem wasn't simply poor business. The business was collapsing. That evening, Emily called again. "Hi, Mom." She sounded unusually cheerful. "Hi. What are you doing tomorrow?" "I don't have any plans." "Perfect. I thought maybe we could have lunch together." "Just us?" "Yes." I hesitated. "That sounds nice." There was something else. "Here it comes," I thought. "I'd like to stop by your house afterward." "For what?" "I found some old family photo albums." "I already have mine." "No," she laughed. "I found Dad's old workshop photos." That immediately caught my attention. Thomas had loved photographing his woodworking projects. "I'd like to see those." "I knew you would." For the first time in days, our conversation actually felt normal. Maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. Maybe Daniel had misunderstood. Maybe Brian was the only one panicking. Maybe Emily truly was caught in the middle. I wanted to believe that. More than anything. Tuesday afternoon after lunch, Emily followed me home. She carried a small cardboard box. Inside were dozens of photographs. Thomas standing beside cabinets he'd built. Thomas teaching Daniel how to sand wood. Thomas holding Sophie as a baby. For nearly an hour, we smiled and laughed together. It felt almost like old times. Then Emily picked up one photograph. Thomas standing in front of Maplewood Community Bank. "I never liked this picture," she said. "Why not?" "Dad looks so serious." I studied the photograph. He did. It had been taken about 2 months before his diagnosis. I think he was meeting with someone there. I don't remember. Emily continued looking at the picture. Then she casually asked, "By the way?" "Yes. Have you been back to the bank recently?" The question came so naturally that most people would have missed it. I didn't. "Why do you ask?" "Oh." She shrugged. "I drove by last week. I thought maybe I'd seen your car." "You probably did." Her eyes lifted from the photograph. "Everything okay with your accounts?" There it was again. The accounts. Always the accounts. "They're fine," she smiled. "Good. Why wouldn't they be?" "No reason." She quickly changed the subject, but I'd already noticed. Even during what appeared to be a peaceful family visit, she still found a way to ask about my money. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I walked downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed Thomas's old workshop, I noticed something unusual. A narrow wooden cabinet stood against the back wall. One Thomas had built himself. For years, he'd kept important blueprints inside. I hadn't opened it since his death. Almost without thinking, I pulled open the bottom drawer. It wouldn't move. Locked. I frowned. Thomas rarely locked anything. I searched nearby until I found an old ring of workshop keys hanging exactly where he'd always left them. The third key fit perfectly. The drawer slid open. Inside, there was only one object. A thick, cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. "For Susan only, if something feels wrong." My heartbeat echoed in the silent workshop. I slowly reached for the envelope. Somehow, I already knew that whatever Thomas had left inside was about to change everything. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope. My name, Thomas's handwriting, and beneath it, the words that sent a chill through my entire body. "For Susan only if something feels wrong." The workshop was completely silent. Even the old wall clock had stopped years ago. I carefully picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than I expected. Inside, I could hear papers sliding against one another. I carried it into the kitchen before opening it. Somehow, sitting beneath the warm light above our old dining table made me feel closer to Thomas. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. The first thing I found was a handwritten letter. The second was a sealed legal envelope. The third was a small flash drive. My eyes immediately returned to the letter. At the top, Thomas had written, "My dearest Susan, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I prayed never would. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this letter simply makes you laugh at an old man's unnecessary caution. But if I'm right, please read every page before making any decisions." Tears blurred my vision. Even after 18 months, seeing his handwriting made it feel as though he'd only stepped into another room. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. Susan. There are 2 possibilities. The first is that life simply became difficult after I was gone. If that's all this is, put these papers away and continue living the beautiful life we've built together. The second possibility is that someone has begun asking questions they should never need answered. Questions about your passwords, your accounts, the deed, your retirement savings, or paperwork they insist you sign quickly. If that has happened, I need you to know something. I stopped reading. Every sentence matched what had been happening over the past several months. Exactly. Word for word. My hands shook harder. Thomas continued. Several months before my diagnosis, I discovered something that deeply troubled me. I wanted to tell you immediately. Instead, I chose to investigate quietly because I hoped I was mistaken. I wasn't. My heart pounded. What had he discovered? I kept reading. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected and found Emily using our home office. She didn't know I had returned. She was making photocopies of our financial records, bank statements, insurance information, property documents. When she saw me, she claimed she was helping organize our paperwork. I wanted to believe her. So I did. Until something else happened. I covered my mouth. Emily had copied our documents. Years before, Thomas died. Not after, before. The next page revealed even more. About 3 weeks later, I received a telephone call from our bank. A teller asked whether I had authorized someone to request detailed information about our savings account. I had not. The request had been denied. The caller had identified herself as a family member. The bank employee wisely refused to provide any information. I immediately drove to the branch. I felt my pulse racing. Rachel? Had she been the teller even? Thomas's letter continued. At the bank, I asked for the security log. Although employees couldn't reveal confidential details, the branch manager privately confirmed enough information for me to understand what had happened. Someone very close to us had been asking questions about our finances. Not stealing. Not yet. Learning. Preparing. Studying. Exactly the way someone studies the blueprint of a house before attempting to enter it. I closed my eyes. Those were almost the exact words Rachel had unknowingly echoed days earlier. Preparing. Studying. Learning. Thomas explained why he had never confronted Emily. I considered accusing her directly, but accusations without proof destroy families. If I was wrong, I would have permanently damaged my relationship with our daughter. If I was right, she would simply become more careful. Instead, I chose another path. One she would never notice. I reached for the second envelope. It remained sealed. Instead, I continued reading. The following week, I met privately with Michael Harris at Maplewood Community Bank. There it was. Michael. He had known. Thomas continued. Together we established confidential protections on every account we owned. Those protections could not legally prevent legitimate transactions. However, they would require additional review whenever unusual activity occurred, especially if someone attempted to withdraw substantial funds while claiming to act on your behalf. My breathing became shallow. This explained Michael's expression. He hadn't been surprised by me. He'd been surprised because Thomas's precautions were finally becoming relevant. Another paragraph made my heart ache. Susan, if you're reading this because Emily has done nothing wrong, then forgive your stubborn husband. I truly hope I misunderstood everything. There is nothing I would rather discover than that I spent my final months worrying about shadows. But if events have unfolded the way I feared, please remember one thing. Emily is still our daughter. She may make terrible decisions. She may betray your trust. But fear and desperation change people. Judge her actions. Do not stop loving her heart. Tears rolled freely down my face. Even now, even after everything, Thomas still wanted to protect Emily. I finally opened the second envelope. Inside were certified copies of several documents. The first confirmed additional fraud protections on our accounts. The second listed emergency contacts, Michael Harris, Rachel Bennett, and Linda Parker, an elder law attorney I'd never met. Attached to the final page was a handwritten note. Linda knows everything. If you ever need help, trust her. My eyes widened. Thomas hadn't simply prepared paperwork. He had built an entire safety net around me, one I had never known existed. Finally, I picked up the flash drive. For several minutes, I hesitated. Then I inserted it into my laptop. Only one video appeared. Its file name read, "For Susan." I clicked play. The screen flickered. Then Thomas appeared. He looked thinner than I remembered. The chemotherapy had already begun. But his eyes were exactly the same. Warm, gentle, steady. He smiled. "Hello, sweetheart." The sound of his voice broke something inside me. I began crying before he spoke another word. "If you're watching this..." Then I wasn't able to explain everything myself. He paused to catch his breath. "I need you to listen carefully. You are stronger than you believe. You always have been." He smiled again. "I know you think I'm the practical one, the careful one, but you've been protecting people your entire life. Students, neighbors, our family. Now, it's time to protect yourself." He leaned slightly closer to the camera. "And Susan, if anyone ever makes you feel guilty for protecting what we've spent 40 years building together, remember this." He looked directly into the camera. "They aren't asking for your trust. They're asking you to surrender your judgment. Those are not the same thing." I covered my face and sobbed. Every doubt I'd carried, every guilty feeling, every moment I'd wondered whether I was being unfair, vanished. Thomas had seen the warning signs before I ever had. He hadn't wanted revenge. He hadn't wanted punishment. He had wanted me safe. The video ended with one final sentence: "I love you." Then the screen went black. I sat alone in the kitchen long after midnight. The envelope remained open beside me. Thomas's letter lay across the table. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt protected. And as dawn slowly approached outside my window, I realized something that changed everything. The banknote Rachel had found was only one part of Thomas's plan. There was still one person I hadn't met: Linda Parker, the attorney who, according to my husband, already knew the entire truth. I barely slept that night. Thomas's letter lay on the kitchen table beside my empty coffee cup, while the flash drive remained plugged into my laptop. Every few hours, I replayed parts of his video. Not because I doubted what I'd heard, because hearing his voice somehow gave me the strength I had been missing for the past 18 months. Just before 8 o'clock the next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the number attached to Linda Parker's business card. The receptionist answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Parker Elder Law. My name is Susan Williams." There was a brief pause. I believe Thomas Williams asked me to contact Ms. Parker if I ever needed help." The receptionist's tone changed instantly. "One moment, Mrs. Williams." Less than 30 seconds later, another voice came onto the line. Warm, professional, calm. "Mrs. Williams." "Yes. My name is Linda Parker. I've been expecting your call." My heart skipped. "You've been expecting it?" "For a long time." I didn't know what to say. "When would you like to come in?" "As soon as possible." "Can you be here at 10? I'll leave right now." Linda's office occupied the second floor of a historic brick building overlooking Maplewood's town square. Unlike the large corporate law firms I'd imagined, her office felt welcoming. Bookshelves lined the walls. Fresh flowers sat on the reception desk. Family photographs rested beside framed law degrees. Nothing about the place felt intimidating. Linda herself appeared to be in her early 60s. Silver hair, kind eyes. The sort of person who immediately made you feel heard. She stood as I entered. Susan? She gently shook my hand. I'm sorry we had to meet this way. So am I. After we settled into her office, she quietly asked, "Did you bring Thomas's letter?" I did. "And the flash drive?" "Yes." She nodded. "I'm glad." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she opened a thick file folder resting on her desk. My name appeared across the front. Susan Williams. I frowned. "How long have you had that file?" Linda smiled sadly. "Almost 2 years." I felt another wave of disbelief. She carefully folded her hands. "Thomas first visited me about 7 months before he passed away." I swallowed. "He never mentioned you." "I asked him not to." "Why?" "Because he hoped you'd never need my services." That sounded exactly like Thomas. Always preparing. Always hoping preparation would prove unnecessary. Linda continued. "He wasn't trying to disinherit anyone. He wasn't trying to punish Emily. He came because something worried him." I nodded slowly. "I know. He wrote about finding Emily copying our financial documents." Linda looked surprised. "He left you the letter?" "Yes." She smiled softly. "Then he trusted his instincts." "What happened after he came here?" Linda opened the file. "He asked me one question. How do I protect my wife without destroying my family?" Tears immediately filled my eyes. That was Thomas, always thinking about everyone else first. Linda slid several documents across the desk. "These are copies." "Copies of what?" "The legal instructions Thomas authorized." I carefully read the first page. It wasn't a new will. It wasn't a trust. Instead, it outlined a series of protective measures. No major financial transactions without enhanced verification. Additional identity confirmation for unusual withdrawals. Independent legal review before transferring real estate. Emergency attorney notification if questionable powers of attorney appeared. Everything had been designed to slow down suspicious activity, not stop legitimate decisions. Simply slow them down. Enough time for someone to ask questions. Enough time for me to think. Thomas knew something I was only beginning to understand. Most financial abuse doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quickly, quietly, while victims feel pressured to make immediate decisions. He had built delays into the system. Delays that created opportunities to recognize danger. Linda leaned back. "There's something else you should know." "What?" "Thomas never accused me of committing a crime." "I understand." "He specifically instructed me never to assume malicious intent." I nodded. "That sounds like him." "But," she paused, "he did ask me to document every concern." She handed me another folder. Inside was a handwritten timeline. Dates, phone calls, bank visits, odd conversations, questions Emily had asked. Everything. Thomas had kept careful notes. One entry caught my attention immediately. March 18th, Emily asked whether Susan still keeps original property deed in HomeSafe. I closed my eyes. That conversation had happened while organizing paperwork. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Thomas had. Another entry. April 7th, Emily asked whether retirement account names beneficiaries directly or through estate. Another, may send unexpected interest in online banking passwords. Then another. June 11th, repeated questions regarding powers of attorney. Every innocent conversation I'd forgotten, Thomas had quietly documented. Not because he wanted evidence against Emily, because he feared one day I might need help seeing a pattern. "I feel terrible," I whispered. Linda looked at me gently. "Why?" I thought I knew my own daughter. You still do. I don't think I do anymore. Linda shook her head. People are complicated. They're capable of tremendous kindness and terrible decisions, sometimes both at the same time. Her words settled into the room. I thought about Emily bringing groceries, helping after Thomas died, holding my hand at the cemetery. Had those moments been real? Or had every act of kindness been part of a larger plan? Almost as though Linda could read my thoughts, she quietly answered, "Don't rewrite every good memory." I looked at her. Fear often pushes decent people into terrible choices. That doesn't mean every loving moment before that was false. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. Then Linda opened the final section of the file. This arrived yesterday. She slid a sealed envelope toward me. It's from Michael Harris. I frowned. The bank manager. Yes. He asked me to wait until after we spoke. My heartbeat quickened. I opened the envelope. Inside was a typed report. At the top, confidential internal memorandum. The document summarized several recent incidents. Emily requesting information about account procedures. The attempted inquiry regarding security protocols. My visit requesting additional protection. Then, the final paragraph. I read it twice. Then a third time. According to bank records, someone had attempted to schedule an appointment for a large withdrawal from my savings account. The appointment had been requested online 3 days earlier. The request had been canceled before confirmation because enhanced fraud protections required direct verbal verification. I slowly looked up. I never requested this. I know, Linda nodded. Neither did the bank. A terrible realization settled over me. Emily hadn't merely been asking questions anymore. She had already begun trying to move the money. The protections Thomas created had stopped her, without her even realizing why. I felt physically sick. I can't believe this. Linda quietly handed me a glass of water. Take your time. After several minutes, I finally asked the question that had haunted me since opening Thomas's envelope. What do I do now? Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked one question of her own. What do you want? I don't want revenge. I didn't think you would. I don't want Emily arrested. I know. My voice broke. I want my daughter back. Linda's eyes softened. So did Thomas. Silence filled the office. Then she spoke carefully. If Emily is willing to tell the truth, there may still be a path toward repairing your family. But first, she closed the file. You need to understand exactly how far this situation has already gone. I frowned. What do you mean? Linda reached into a locked cabinet behind her desk. She removed another file. This one was much thinner. Across the front were only 4 handwritten words. Brian Carter, Financial Records. My heart began racing again. Because whatever Linda was about to show me was the reason Emily had become so desperate to reach my $80,000. Linda placed the thin file on her desk, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked directly at me. What I'm about to show you came from public records court filings and information Thomas legally obtained before he passed away. I nodded. So, nothing here was gathered illegally. I understand. He wanted facts, not assumptions. That sounded exactly like Thomas. He had never believed in rumors, only evidence. Linda slowly opened the folder. The first page contained a timeline of Brian Carter construction. At first glance, it looked like the history of a successful small business. Revenue increased every year for nearly a decade. New employees, larger contracts, commercial remodeling projects. Everything appeared healthy. Then one column caught my attention. The year after the pandemic, profit dropped sharply. The following year, it dropped again. The year after that, the company operated at a loss. Linda pointed to the numbers. Brian expanded too quickly. What do you mean? He borrowed heavily. For equipment, additional trucks, a larger warehouse. He expected business to keep growing. But it didn't. I stared silently at the reports. The next document listed outstanding loans, equipment financing, business credit lines, commercial vehicle leases. Altogether, the total exceeded $761,000. I looked up in disbelief. I had no idea. Neither did most people, Linda replied quietly. Brian worked very hard to maintain the appearance of success. I remembered the expensive neighborhood, the new pickup truck, the vacations Emily occasionally posted online. Everything had looked comfortable. Now I understood why. They had been living on borrowed money. Linda turned another page. This is where things became more serious. Several suppliers had filed lawsuits. One bank had frozen a commercial credit account. Insurance premiums had gone unpaid. Tax obligations had fallen behind. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Payroll. What is this? Linda sighed. According to court filings, Brian delayed payroll for several employees. He couldn't pay them. Not on time. My heart sank. Thomas had always believed paying workers came before paying yourself. He often skipped buying new tools rather than delay an employee's paycheck. The thought of Brian leaving families without income made me deeply uncomfortable. Another document listed the company's available cash. I blinked. Surely I had read it incorrectly. Less than $9,000 for an entire construction company. Is this accurate? As of the most recent filing? Linda nodded. He was running out of liquidity. I remembered something Daniel had texted me. If they don't get your money, we'll lose everything. Suddenly, those words made terrible sense. Brian wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for survival. Unfortunately, he had chosen the wrong source. Linda slid another page toward me. This one concerns Emily. I immediately looked down. The document wasn't criminal, nor did it accuse her of fraud. Instead, it summarized several financial transfers. Emily had borrowed against her retirement account. She had taken a home equity loan. She had refinanced their mortgage. She had even sold inherited jewelry from Thomas's mother. I recognized every piece: the pearl earrings, the antique bracelet, the gold watch Thomas had received from his father. I remembered asking Emily where they had gone. She'd smiled. They're in the safety deposit box. They weren't. She had already sold them. A wave of sadness washed over me, not because of the jewelry, because she had lied so easily. I don't understand. I looked at Linda. If she'd already done all of this, why not tell me? Linda answered gently. What do most people fear more than financial failure? I thought for a moment. Embarrassment. She nodded. Shame. Disappointing people they love. I looked back at the file. Emily hadn't started by asking for my savings. She had exhausted nearly everything else first. Loans, retirement, jewelry, home equity. Only then had she turned toward me. That realization hurt more than anything. She hadn't chosen me first. She had chosen me last. The last remaining financial resource she believed she could reach. Linda handed me another document. This came from Michael Harris. It summarized activity surrounding my accounts during the previous 6 months. No unauthorized withdrawals had succeeded. Every unusual inquiry had been blocked. Every attempted shortcut had failed. Thomas's safeguards had worked exactly as intended. Then I noticed one handwritten sentence at the bottom. Customer appears unaware of repeated third-party information gathering attempts. Customer, me, repeated attempts, plural. How many times? I whispered. Linda checked another page. 7. I stared at her. 7? She nodded. Over the last 8 months. Questions about procedures, quests for information, appointment inquiries, verification attempts. Everyone had been refused. I suddenly understood why Rachel had recognized my name immediately. The bank staff had quietly been protecting me for months, without ever frightening me. Tears filled my eyes. I should have noticed. Linda shook her head. No, I should have. No, Susan. Her voice became firmer. Financial exploitation succeeds because trust already exists. Parents trust children. Grandparents trust grandchildren. Spouses trust each other. Trust isn't weakness. It's exactly what people exploit. I slowly nodded. Part of the guilt I'd been carrying finally began lifting. Then, Linda reached for the final document. I debated whether to show you this. What is it? A statement. From whom? Kevin Mitchell, Brian's employee. The same Kevin he'd mentioned during dinner. My pulse quickened. What does it say? Linda handed me the statement. Kevin had voluntarily spoken with investigators involved in one of Brian's civil lawsuits. Most of it concerned construction contracts. Then, halfway down the page, one paragraph stood out. Brian repeatedly stated that his mother-in-law had significant retirement savings and that once family financial matters were resolved, the company would recover. I stopped reading. My chest tightened. Family financial matters. He hadn't referred to me as Susan, not as family, not even as Emily's mother. Just a financial solution. I don't want you to misunderstand. Linda spoke carefully. This statement doesn't prove Brian committed a crime. I know. But it does show how he viewed your savings. I nodded silently. Not as emergency money for a retired widow. Not as Thomas's lifetime of hard work. As capital. Available capital. Linda closed the file. For now. Everything remains protected. What happens next? That depends. On what? On Emily. I frowned. What do you mean, if she's acting entirely on her own? One path exists. If she's simply following Brian's lead, another exists. And if both knowingly planned this together? She let the sentence fade. I looked out the office window toward the town square below. Children laughed near the fountain. An elderly couple crossed the street holding hands. Life continued exactly as it always had. Meanwhile, my own family seemed to be quietly unraveling. As I prepared to leave, Linda handed me a small envelope. Thomas asked me to give you this only after you'd read everything else. I looked at the handwriting. Once again, it belonged to my husband. On the front, he had written only one sentence. Don't confront them until you know the whole truth. I slipped the envelope into my purse. I won't. Linda smiled gently. I think Thomas would be proud of how carefully you've handled all of this. I wasn't so sure. I still felt frightened, heartbroken, confused. But one thing had changed. For weeks, I had wondered whether I was imagining danger. Now, I knew the danger was real. The only question left was whether Emily still had enough honesty left to stop before everything, including her own family, was destroyed forever. I drove home from Linda Parker's office with Thomas's final envelope resting on the passenger seat. I wanted to open it immediately. Instead, I forced myself to wait. Thomas had spent a lifetime making careful decisions. The least to do was follow his example. When I arrived home, I made a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. No legal language, no financial instructions, just Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. My sweet Susan, if you've reached this letter, then you've already learned enough to understand what has been happening. Now I need to ask something much harder of you. Please don't let anger make your decisions. Truth first, then judgment. I know you're hurting. If Emily has betrayed your trust, she'll eventually have to face the consequences. But before that happens, give her one opportunity to tell you the truth on her own. Not because she deserves another chance, because you deserve to know whether the daughter we raised is still somewhere beneath the fear. If she chooses honesty, you'll have peace. If she chooses another lie, you'll have certainty. And certainty is sometimes the greatest gift we receive. I folded the letter carefully. Thomas wasn't asking me to ignore what had happened. He wasn't asking me to forgive blindly. He simply wanted me to give Emily one final chance to choose honesty. I decided I would. That evening, I called Emily. "Hi, Mom." Her cheerful voice sounded exactly as it always had. "Can you come over tomorrow evening?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" "I'd rather talk in person." A brief silence followed. "Okay, I'll be there." She didn't ask any more questions. The following afternoon, I spent hours preparing dinner. Not because I expected a celebration, because cooking had always helped calm my nerves. I made Thomas's favorite pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh rolls, apple pie, the same meal we'd shared every anniversary for almost 40 years. At exactly 6 o'clock, Emily arrived alone. "No, Brian. He had a meeting." I simply nodded. Part of me wondered whether that meeting actually existed. Another part no longer cared. We sat down at the dining table. For several minutes, we ate in silence. Finally, Emily looked at me. "You've been quiet." "I've been thinking." "So have I." She smiled nervously. "I really hate that things have been awkward." "So do I." I set down my fork. "I have a question." "Okay. I'd like you to answer honestly." She nodded immediately. "Of course." I looked directly into her eyes. "Is your family in financial trouble?" Her smile disappeared. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she laughed softly. "What makes you ask that?" I didn't answer. Instead, I waited. People often reveal more in silence than conversation. Finally, she sighed. "Business has been a little slower." "Emily." I kept my voice calm. "I'm asking again." She looked away. "We're managing." "That's not what I asked." Another silence. Then she nodded once. "Yes." The word barely escaped her lips. "Yes." I felt both relieved and heartbroken. At least, she hadn't lied. Not yet. "How serious is it?" She stared at her plate. "Worse than I've admitted." "How much worse?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know where to begin." "Start anywhere." She took a shaky breath. "Brian kept telling me things would improve." They didn't. We borrowed. Then borrowed again. We refinanced. We used my retirement. We sold jewelry. She wiped away tears. I thought every decision would be the last one we'd have to make. But there was always another bill, another loan, another lawsuit. I quietly listened, for the first time in months. Emily wasn't trying to persuade me. She wasn't presenting spreadsheets. She wasn't asking about my accounts. She was simply talking. Like my daughter again. I was ashamed, she whispered. I didn't want you to know. I would have helped. I know. She looked at me with red eyes. That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. I frowned. I didn't want you thinking we'd failed. You wouldn't have failed. But I felt like we had. The pain in her voice sounded genuine, completely genuine. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Emily, she looked up. Did you try to get access to my savings? Everything changed. Her shoulders stiffened. The tears stopped. The room fell silent. She stared at me, then slowly lowered her head. I already knew the answer. I simply needed to hear it from her. She swallowed. Yes. The single word shattered what remained of my heart. I asked questions. She continued quietly. I looked into the accounts. I tried to understand what would happen if you ever needed help. I shook my head gently. No, don't change the question. She began crying again. I didn't start out wanting your money. I believe that. She covered her face. Everything kept getting worse. I was terrified. Brian said if we could just stabilize the company, we'd pay everything back. Every penny. I listened without interrupting. But then, she whispered, it stopped being about borrowing. It became about convincing you. I closed my eyes. She had finally said it. Without excuses, without blaming anyone else. I was wrong, she sobbed. So wrong. I knew every time I asked another question, I was crossing another line. But I couldn't figure out how to stop. I reached across the table and gently took her trembling hand. She looked at me in surprise. I love you, I said softly. I always will. She burst into tears. But loving you, I continued, doesn't mean pretending none of this happened, she nodded through her sobs. I know. I've betrayed your trust. Yes. I don't know how to fix it. I don't either. We sat there crying together, mother and daughter. Neither of us speaking. Neither of us pretending anymore. After several minutes, I quietly asked one final question. Does Brian know everything you've done? Emily hesitated. Too long. Then, very slowly, she shook her head. No. My heartbeat quickened. What do you mean? I never told him everything. He knew I was trying to convince you. But, she looked down at the table. He doesn't know what I did behind his back. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Emily, what did you do? She closed her eyes, then whispered the words that changed everything. I was the one who submitted the withdrawal request. I stopped breathing. The one the bank blocked, she nodded. I used your information. I thought if the money was already in our account, I could explain everything afterward. The room spun. Thomas's protections hadn't merely stopped Brian. They had stopped my own daughter. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Emily sat across from me with tears streaming down her face while I struggled to accept the words I'd just heard. I was the one who submitted the withdrawal request. Part of me wanted to ask how she could possibly do such a thing. Another part already knew the answer. Fear, desperation, shame. Those emotions don't excuse betrayal, but they often explain it. Finally, I broke the silence. When Emily wiped her eyes. 3 weeks ago. The appointment request. She nodded. I filled it out online. Why? I thought if I could get the appointment scheduled, figure everything else out later. I stared at her. You knew you didn't have permission. I know. You knew it was wrong. I know. Then why? She buried her face in her hands. Because I wasn't thinking like your daughter anymore. I felt another tear slide down my cheek. I was thinking like someone drowning. Emily slowly looked up. You deserve to know everything. I do. She nodded. The company wasn't just losing money. It was days away from shutting down. Brian believed one new commercial contract would save everything. But he needed enough cash to keep operating until then. How much? She answered, almost in a whisper. $80,000. Exactly. Every dollar in my savings account. I closed my eyes. It had never been a random number. It had always been my retirement savings. I told him we couldn't ask you, Emily continued. He said we weren't asking. We were borrowing. I looked at her quietly. And you believed him? I wanted to. She lowered her head. I needed to. She explained how the conversations had changed over the previous year. At first, Brian only talked about temporary cash flow problems. Then overdue invoices. Then unpaid suppliers. Then lawsuits. Eventually, every conversation ended the same way. Your mom has money sitting there doing nothing. Every time Emily resisted, Brian reminded her that the business supported dozens of employees. Families, children, mortgages. If the company fails, it's not just us. Emily admitted she slowly began convincing herself that taking my money wasn't really stealing. It was saving jobs, saving their marriage, saving their future. And once the new contract paid, we'd return every penny. She looked at me hopefully. I swear we would have. I believed she believed that, but belief doesn't erase consequences. I stood and walked toward the living room window. Outside the roses. Thomas had planted gently moved in the evening breeze. He had spent 40 years building security for our family. One desperate decision could have destroyed it all. Without turning around, I asked, Did Brian tell you to submit the withdrawal request? Emily was silent. I waited. Finally. No. I turned back toward her. He didn't know. He wanted me to keep persuading you. He kept saying eventually you'd agree. But, she swallowed. I panicked. I thought if I solved everything before he found out, I'd save all of us. I searched her face. For the first time since Thomas died. I wasn't looking at a manipulative daughter. I was looking at a frightened woman who had made one terrible decision after another until she no longer recognized herself. The next morning, I called Linda Parker. After listening carefully, she asked only one question. Did Emily confess voluntarily? Yes. Did you pressure her? No. Did you record the conversation? No. Linda sighed softly. I didn't expect you would. What should I do? Bring her to my office. Today, if she's truly ready to tell the truth. Today, Emily agreed immediately. I'll go. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask whether there would be police. She simply nodded. I don't want to keep lying. That alone told me something had changed. When we arrived, Linda welcomed us into her office. Emily looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in weeks. Linda spoke gently. Emily, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to understand. For nearly 2 hours, Emily answered every question honestly. She described Brian's business problems, the mounting debts, the pressure, the conversations about my savings, the paperwork, the realtor, the phone calls to the bank. Finally, she admitted submitting the online withdrawal request herself. Linda took careful notes. When Emily finished, the office became quiet. Then Linda asked one final question. If you could go back 6 months, what would you do differently? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she began crying harder than she had all evening before. I would have told my mother the truth. Not asked for money, not hidden debts, not lied. The truth. I was so afraid she'd think I was a failure. She whispered. I never realized she'd rather know the truth than believe a lie. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. I always would have. 2 days later, Brian called me for the first time in weeks. Susan? His voice sounded unusually confident. I've been meaning to stop by. I don't think that's a good idea. There was a pause. Emily told me she's been upset. She has. I think you've misunderstood a few things. I closed my eyes. No. I finally understand them. Another silence. Then his tone changed. What exactly has Emily told you? Enough. I'd really rather discuss this in person. So would I answered calmly. But not alone, he hesitated. What does that mean? It means my attorney will be present. The line went completely silent. Several seconds passed. Then Brian quietly asked, You hired an attorney? No. My husband did. Another long silence. Finally. I see. He ended the call without another word. That afternoon, Linda called. I have an update. What happened? Brian contacted his own attorney. I wasn't surprised. He wants to negotiate. Negotiate what? A repayment agreement. I frowned. Repayment. He believes that may prevent further legal complications. I sat quietly. The money had never actually left my account. Thomas's safeguards had prevented that. Yet Brian already understood the seriousness of what had happened. Perhaps, for the first time, he realized this wasn't simply a family disagreement. It involved legal documents, financial institutions, recorded requests, electronic records. Every action left a trail. A week later, Brian arrived at Linda's office with his attorney. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. His confidence had disappeared. He didn't deny the company's financial problems. He didn't deny encouraging Emily to convince me to help. But he firmly denied knowing she had submitted the withdrawal request. I never told her to do that, he said quietly. I wanted Susan to agree voluntarily. Linda looked at him. Can you prove that? He shook his head. No. Emily spoke before anyone else could. He's telling the truth. The room fell silent. She looked directly at me. The withdrawal request was my decision. I crossed that line. Not him. Brian turned toward her in complete shock. You never told me. Emily slowly shook her head. I couldn't. At that moment, I finally understood what Thomas had hoped for. Not perfection, not revenge, the truth. At last, every lie had been brought into the light. Only one question remained. Could a family survive after trust had been broken so completely? 3 weeks later, we all met one final time. Not at my house, not at the bank, but in Linda Parker's conference room. Around the table sat Linda Michael Harris from Maplewood Community Bank, Brian and his attorney Emily and me. It was the first time everyone involved had been in the same room. The atmosphere was quiet. No one argued. No one raised their voice. There was simply nothing left to hide. Linda began. Before we discuss legal matters, I'd like to clarify one important fact. She looked around the room. Mrs. Susan Williams did not lose any money. Michael nodded. Every attempted inquiry and every unusual request involving Mrs. Williams's accounts was stopped by the enhanced protections established by Thomas Williams before his death. He turned toward me. Your husband thought several steps ahead. A small smile appeared on my face. That sounds like Thomas. Michael smiled back. It certainly does. Brian stood first. He looked exhausted. The confident businessman I had known for years was gone. In his place stood a man carrying the weight of too many bad decisions. Susan, he swallowed hard. I owe you an apology. You do? I convinced myself that borrowing your retirement savings was the only way to save my company. He lowered his eyes. I never stopped to ask whether I had the right. No, you didn't. He nodded. I know. His attorney slid several documents across the table. Brian had agreed to liquidate the remaining business assets. Sell unused equipment. Close the warehouse. Use every available dollar to repay outstanding suppliers and employees before addressing his own financial interests. I should have done this months ago, he admitted quietly. I kept believing one more project would fix everything. Linda looked at him. Hope isn't a financial strategy. Brian gave a sad smile. I've learned that. Then Emily spoke. She looked at me instead of anyone else. I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. It isn't. I know. She wiped away tears. I betrayed your trust. I lied. I tried to gain access to money that wasn't mine. I don't expect forgiveness today. I remained silent. She continued. I've already signed a statement accepting responsibility for submitting the withdrawal request. I've also agreed to cooperate completely with the bank and with any investigation if one becomes necessary. Linda confirmed everything. Emily hadn't attempted to minimize her actions. She hadn't blamed Brian. She hadn't blamed stress. She had accepted responsibility for the first time in many months. She sounded like the daughter Thomas and I had raised. Because Emily cooperated fully, voluntarily admitted what she had done before any financial loss occurred, and no funds had actually been withdrawn. The matter was resolved without criminal prosecution. Instead, the bank permanently documented the attempted unauthorized activity. Emily signed legally binding acknowledgments that she would never again represent herself as acting on my behalf without written authorization. All future financial matters involving me would require independent legal review. The safeguards Thomas created would remain permanently attached to my accounts. Michael looked at me kindly. Mrs. Williams, I hope these protections will never be needed again. So do I. Brian's business closed within 2 months. It wasn't the ending he had dreamed about, but every employee received the wages they were still owed before the company officially dissolved. Brian accepted a project management position with another construction firm. Ironically, he later admitted earning a steady paycheck brought him far more peace than constantly chasing impossible business growth. He and Emily entered marriage counseling. Whether their marriage would survive, no one could say. Some wounds require years to heal. Others never completely disappear. Daniel and Sophie continued visiting every Friday. One evening, Daniel quietly handed me a folded piece of paper. I wrote something. I unfolded it. It simply read, "Thank you for not giving up on Mom." I looked at him. I came close. "I know," he smiled. "But you didn't." Children often understand grace better than adults. A month later, Emily asked if she could visit me alone. No paperwork, no folders, no financial discussions. Just coffee. She sat at the same kitchen table where she'd once confessed everything. "I don't expect things to go back to normal." "They won't." "I know." She looked around the room. "Dad built this table." "He did." "I almost destroyed everything he spent his life protecting." I reached into the kitchen drawer. From it, I removed Thomas's final handwritten letter, the one he'd left only for me. "I want you to read something." Emily carefully read every page. When she reached the sentence, "Judge her actions. Do not stop loving her heart," she broke down crying. "He still believed in me," she whispered. "Yes. Even after everything." "Yes." She covered her face. "I didn't deserve that." "No," I answered gently. "But love isn't always about deserving. It's often a choice." That autumn, I made a decision of my own. Not because anyone pressured me, because it finally felt right. I met with Linda Parker and created a new estate plan. Everything was transparent. Everything was reviewed carefully. Everything was explained line by line. I also established a small charitable literacy fund in Thomas Williams' name. Every year, it would provide books and scholarships for children in Maplewood whose families couldn't afford them. Thomas had spent his life building with wood. It seemed fitting that part of his legacy would now help build futures through education. At the dedication ceremony, Michael Harris quietly approached me. "I think Thomas would have liked this." I smiled. "I think so too." Sometimes people ask whether I ever trusted Emily again. The truthful answer is, not immediately. Trust isn't repaired with apologies. It's repaired through consistent actions over time. For months, Emily never once asked about my finances, never mentioned my savings, never offered unsolicited advice about selling my home. Instead, she simply showed up. She helped in the garden. She brought dinner. She spent time with me because she wanted to, not because she wanted something. Little by little, a new relationship began to grow, different from the old one, perhaps stronger because it was finally built on honesty instead of assumptions. I still live in the little white house Thomas and I bought all those years ago. The roses he planted continue blooming every spring. His workshop remains exactly as he left it. Sometimes I still sit there with a cup of coffee listening to the silence, and every now and then I imagine hearing his familiar voice. "Read everything. Take your time. Protect yourself." Those lessons saved far more than my retirement savings. They saved my dignity, my independence, and in a way I never expected, they gave my daughter one final opportunity to become the person she'd almost forgotten she could be. If there's one lesson my story has taught me, it's this. Love your family with all your heart. But never confuse love with surrendering your judgment. The people who truly love you will never ask you to stop thinking. And if someone pressures you, act quickly, hide information, or make decisions you don't fully understand. Slow down. Ask questions. Read every page. Because protecting yourself isn't a sign that you love your family less. Sometimes, it's the very thing that gives your family a chance to find its way back. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If this journey touched your heart, Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you love. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you were in my place, could you have forgiven your child, wherever you're watching from? Thank you for spending this time